So, did you succeed? Let's solve this together. In task number 1, we should create 2 new components. So I'll go to the source folder and create a components folder, and in there add an active user.view file and also the user data.view file. These are the 2 components we should create here, active user and user data. Active user will then be about outputting user data, so it will have a field for the username and the age, and user data, so this second component, will be about fetching user input, about letting the user of this web application enter data for name and age. Now let's start with active user maybe, and let's add a template there, and also our script area. And in the script area, I'll just export my config object. At the moment it's empty, because at the moment we don't need to add any logic yet. And in the template, I want to have a h2 and a h3 tag, and you could just enter those tags. I will actually wrap them with a section here. This is not mandatory though. And then in this section we have the h2 tag, where we will soon output the name of the user. For the moment, I'll just output my name, but that's going to change. And then also the age here, in my case, 31 years. But this is also soon going to change. It will soon be dynamic. So that's the simple template here. And we can also add some styling here if we want to. Now, I will do that. I will add some styling here, but only some basic styling. And I will ensure that my section here basically just has a margin of 2 rem and auto, so that it's centered, that it has a max width of, let's say, 40 rem, and I'll give it a border radius of 12 pixels, and add a border of 1 pixel solid and a light gray color. Side note, this will style all sections in your app, not just in this component. We will later learn how you can lock styling to a specific component, but at the moment, this will style all sections in all components, even though it is defined in this component. But I will come back to that styling later. So that's the very basic styling I will add here for now. And with that, I'll move on to user data. And there also add a template and a script section, of course. And just as before, in the script section, we can export an empty config object for the moment. And in the template here, I will also add a section. And as I just explained, this will therefore also get the styling defined in the other component, which is weird, I will admit that. But again, we'll dive deeper into styling components later. The more important thing here is that in this section, we want to have 2 input fields for the name and the age. So therefore here I'll add an input field of type text, which should get the username, and another input field also of type text. Let's say we could also use type number, but I'll go for text, which gets the age. I'll add some placeholders here to make it easier to identify the correct input field. Here I'll say your name, and here I will say your age. And of course, you can also add labels. You can also add styling here. I will keep this very, very simple here because I don't want to waste too much time on the styling. This is not a CSS course after all. I want to focus on the components and the component communication at this moment, because that's what this assignment is all about. So now we got these 2 components, very basic components, but they have what they should have. And we added some basic styling as well. And with that, we're done with task 1. In task 2, we should output both side by side in the main app template. And that, of course, means, first of all, that we need a main app. At the moment, we got these components, but we got no main app where everything would start. So next to main.js, I'm going to add this app.view file, which will be our main app, where we then will start using our other components. Now, we create this main app just as we create all the components though, since, as you learned, components are just Vue apps, and therefore the main app is not configured in any different way. And we export our config object for the main app, and then here in the template, I want to use these 2 components. And for that, we first of all need to let Vue know about these components, right? That's important. We need to register those two components. Otherwise, we can't use them here. So let's go to main.js. And in there, we can import active user from /components active user.view, and also import user data from /components user data.view. So import those config objects and the templates, and however the Vue CLI combines them behind the scenes. And once they are imported, we can store our app in a constant here to make working with it a bit easier. And before we mount it, we can also call component and register our two components here. Now I'll name the first one active user. That will be my custom HTML tag, so to say. And I'll point at the active user config object here. And for the second component, we can use user data, for example, and point at user data. You should use multiple words combined with a dash here, as you learned, to make sure that your names here don't clash with built-in default HTML elements. So now we created those components and we made Vue aware of it. Now back in app.vue, we can use them. I'll wrap them with a div here, though that's not something you have to use. But then more important, in that div, I'll have my active-user element, and I have my user data custom element, so to say. And if we save that all, we can run npm run serve to start our development server and hopefully see something on the screen. So let's wait for that to start up. And I got an empty screen. And this makes a lot of sense because in main.js, I'm registering the components and everything. I'm using them here in app.vue, but what am I not doing? Well, I'm not importing app.vue, and I'm not using that as my actual app. The actual app I'm creating here is still an empty object. Of course, here we want to use the app we're creating in the app.vue file. After all, that's the app which has the template that uses those components. So it's this app which we should pass to create app. And with that done, if we save that, here's what we get. Now, okay, I will admit it, the styling is not super beautiful, but hey, it's about the components anyways. So we got our data here, we got the two input fields here, and now it's about connecting everything. Now, since it's super ugly, I'll tweak the styling a little bit. I will actually take that section here, this entire style block from active-user.vue, and add it to app.vue. Since it's getting applied globally anyways, we can do it like this. Give that some padding, and also target the overall HTML element and set my font family to sans serif to make this a little bit nicer. Yeah, that's a little bit nicer. But now with that, we completed task number 2. So we're using both components. In task number 3, we should now ensure that we actually don't just have some dummy data, which we output here in active user, but that we manage some data which can be changed with help of the user data component later. And that, of course, starts with one important question. Where do we manage that user data? I mean, we have to manage it with help of the data property in some Vue config object, but which of our 3 apps do we use for that? Do we manage the user data in the active user component, in the user data component, or in our main app? Well, we could go for active user. That's where we need the data after all. But if we manage our data here, changing it from inside user data will be pretty hard since we have no easy way of communicating between those two components. So user, active user, might not be the best component to manage our user data. Instead, we want to pick a component which has access to both components. So we want to pick our main app, because if we manage our user data there, we can tell it to change that data from inside user data by emitting a custom event here. And at the same time, we can pass the managed data down to active user. So our app.vue file, our main app, has access to both components that interact with the user data. So we want to manage that data in such a place. So therefore, in app.vue, in the config object here, we add our data option and return our data object here. And in there, we can now manage our user data. We could have a user field here, which is another nested object. And that user has a name, let's say, in my case, Maximilian Schwarzmuller. And it has an age, which is just a number. That could be our user data, which is managed here. And if we manage it here, we can pass it to active user with props. That's the idea behind props. We can configure a component from outside. So that means in active user, we now want to specify the props we're about to accept. And it's your component, so you can pick any prop names you want. And I'll accept a username and a user age prop. But you could also just go for age and name if you preferred that. You can also use the longer prop definition you learned about and provide this object form where you then define username in greater detail. And you make it clear that this is a string and that it's required, for example. And actually, I'll do that here, though if you just went with an array, so with that shorter form of defining props, that would also be okay for this assignment. But I'll go for the longer form here, make it clear that we have a string and a number type here, and that both are required. And with that, we can now pass data to these props, username and user age, on this component. So we can use these props like attributes on an HTML element. And we can set username to a certain value and user age to a certain value. And I will set username here to the name I'm storing in this user. Hence, we need to bind it to a dynamic value since I want to refer to data managed in this view instance. And I will refer to user.name. So to this user data property and then in there the name field. And we do pretty much the same for a user age. There we refer to user.age. And with that, we're passing data for these props to active user. And inside of active user, we can now refer to these props and output the prop data instead of the hard-coded values here. So with interpolation, we can refer to username, so to this prop, because you learned that these props are available just like data properties inside of this component. And we do the same here. I output user age years. And user age, of course, is that other prop we're getting. Of course, you have to use the exact names here in your template as you used for defining the props. And you, of course, also have to use exactly the same names for providing the data to that component. And now if we save that, we can see Maximilian Schwarzmuller and 31 years. But if we, for example, change this to Max Schwarzmuller here in our data in the app.view file, we see that this updates to Max Schwarzmuller. So passing down the values works. Now let's also hook up the user data component. There we got these input fields, and these input fields are there to allow the user of this web application to change the name and age we're managing here. So therefore, in the user data component, I will first of all add a button, set user data could be the caption of this button. And when we press this button, that data should be taken. So whatever the user entered up to this point will be taken. And that entered data should then be provided to app.view so that there we can update the stored user data. And then View will detect that this data changed, and the updated data will be provided to active user, and there the template will be updated, and hence the DOM will be updated and our changes will be reflected there. That's the idea, at least. So in user data, we got this button. I will actually wrap this all into a form, which is not mandatory though, but I'll do it here. And now we need to manage the entered data here in our user data component. So the data that's being entered into these inputs. Or alternatively, you could of course also use refs here for fetching what the user entered when the button is pressed. But I will do it old school, so to say, and I will store the entered data with every keystroke by managing two pieces of data in this component, the entered name, which is an empty string initially, and the entered age, which is an empty string initially. And we can then bind that with vModel here to entered name, and on the second input, we bind this to entered age. So now whatever the user enters into those input fields will be stored with every keystroke into these fields down there. Of course, we now want to react to this form being submitted, which will happen when this button is pressed. So we can listen to the submit event here with @submit and use the prevent modifier to prevent this browser default of submitting the form and sending a HTTP request, which would lead to the page being reloaded. And then we can call a method of our choice, and I will call that method submit data, though that name, as always, is up to you. You just have to add it then to your methods configuration, add the submit data method to this config object here. And in submit data, we now want to do what? We now want to emit a custom event, because ultimately we want to let our main app know about the two pieces of data, the name and the age, that was entered by the user. So here I call this $emit to emit a custom event, and we now can pick any event name of our choice, for example set-data. But again, this name is up to you. And this event will also carry some data. It should contain the entered name and age, so I'll forward this entered name and this entered age, so that we can get that data in whichever place we're listening to that event, which will be the app.view file soon. I will also add the emits key here to make it clear which kind of events this component emits, and that's of course the set-data event, which we will eventually emit. So now we're emitting that, we're fetching all the data, we're storing it, and then eventually when the button is pressed and the form is submitted, we emit the custom event with that entered data. And now in app.view, where we are using the user data component, we can listen to this custom event. We can listen to set data and then call any method of our choice here. So let's add a method in our main app config object, and that could be the setUserData method. As always, those names are up to you. And it's that setUserData method at which I want to point here. And now again, you will get some data here. You will get the entered name and the entered age. These two arguments are received in that custom method. So here we'll get the name and age. These two parameters, will get them because that's the data we're passing when the event is emitted. And therefore, inside of this method body, we can now reach out to our user and replace it with a new object, let's say. So reach out to this user, which we manage in our data. And on that new object, set the name to the name we receive here as a parameter and set the age to the received age. So we want to have the name and age fields because we had them before and because we're passing these fields down to active user. But now we set them to the new values we receive when this custom event is emitted. Well, and that should be all. If we now saved it all, we start with Max Schwarzmuller. But if I now enter Maximilian here and 32 and I click set user data, you see that updated. And of course, I can update this as often as I want. Now here's a little tweak we could do, which is not required as it works like before. You might notice that initially my age is a number here. And then here I'm fetching the entered age as a string, because if a user enters something into an input, it will always be a string. Even if what was entered is a number, it will be a number treated as a string then. And I'm emitting this as a string therefore, and then I'm using this as a string. So once we updated the data with help of setUserData, age will no longer be a number but a string. Now that's not a technical problem in JavaScript, that works just fine. And since we're just using this number to output it in our active user component, that also doesn't have any negative consequences. But actually, we wanted a type number here on this prop, right? And therefore, if you open up the console log, indeed, you get a warning. invalid prop, type check failed for user age, expected number, but got string. So whilst everything works, we technically don't have a perfect app here. We have a minor error. Of course, we could be fine with getting a string number here, because we're just outputting it anyways. We're not using it in a calculation, so it doesn't matter if it's a number or string. But if we do expect a number here, and you might have other components where this does matter, then we should do one thing. We should convert it. So here in app.view, when we store our age, when we set our new age, we should convert age to a number first, and we can simply do so by adding a plus in front of it. This will convert this string to a number, so to type number. And that's just a minor thing. We'll not see a difference on the screen, but we'll now get rid of that error. If I reload and clear the error log, if I now set a new value here, you see I get no warning anymore, because now we're working with the correct type of data. Again, it's a minor thing, but it is important to be aware of such things, also to avoid unexpected bugs which you might face in other applications. But with that, that's the assignment solved. You might have a different solution, does not mean that it's wrong, but hopefully my solution here helps you understand my thought process and helps you build Vue applications with components.